Here's something nobody in the Nigerian media is saying out loud. The political bloc that handed Bola Ahmed Tinubu the presidency, his own people, the Yoruba Southwest, is now the region where his approval numbers are collapsing the fastest. Think about what that means. A sitting Nigerian president, less than 2 years from a re-election campaign, is losing ground not in the north, where he never had a stronghold, not in the southeast, where opposition was expected, but in Lagos, in Ogun, in Oyo, in the very geopolitical zone that was supposed to be his unbreakable base. The question nobody is asking is this: if Tinubu cannot hold the southwest, what exactly is his path to 2027? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the answer is going to reframe everything you thought you understood about Nigerian politics heading into the next election cycle. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Inside Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand what is happening, you have to understand what was supposed to happen. When Tinubu won the 2023 presidential election with 37% of the votes in a three-way race, the foundational argument of his campaign was this: the Yoruba Southwest delivered as a bloc, and that delivery would be repaid through governance that protected Yoruba interests at the federal level. That was the political contract: shared prosperity, federal appointments reflecting Yoruba political weight, and a president who understood what the region needed. Less than 18 months into his administration, that contract is under visible strain. What triggered this particular moment is a convergence of three developments arriving at the same time. First, the fuel subsidy removal and its economic fallout hit Lagos, Nigeria's commercial capital and the heartbeat of Yoruba middle-class prosperity, harder than almost any other city in the country. Second, a series of federal appointments drew sharp criticism from prominent Yoruba political voices who argued the Southwest was being systematically sidelined in the distribution of key positions. Third, and this is where it gets structurally important, several influential figures within the pan-Yoruba socio-political organization, Afenifere, began publicly distancing themselves from the Tinubu administration in language that was pointed and deliberate. This is not a news story. The tension between a Yoruba president and Yoruba expectations has a historical precedent, but what makes this moment different is the timing. We are still outside the 2027 campaign window, which means this is not yet electoral noise. This is the base sending a message before the noise starts, and that is a different kind of political signal entirely. Now, I want to come back to something specific about those Afenifere statements, because what was said publicly is far less interesting than what was said privately. We will get to that. But first, let us look at the institutions. To understand why Yoruba dissatisfaction has political consequences beyond social media outrage, you have to look at the institutional architecture through which that dissatisfaction can be converted into action. The first institution is INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission. Nigeria's presidential election is decided not by a national popular vote alone, but by a constitutional formula. A candidate must win the most votes nationally and secure at least 25% of votes in no fewer than 2/3 of the 36 states. If Tinubu loses the Southwest's enthusiasm to the point where turnout collapses, he does not merely lose margin, he risks losing threshold compliance in states he should own by default. The second institution is the National Assembly. The Southwest's combined senators and House of Representatives members represent a significant bloc. When that bloc begins to fracture on key legislative votes, budget defense, executive confirmation hearings, constitutional amendment debates, the presidency loses its most reliable legislative floor. Watch the National Assembly voting patterns closely. They are already beginning to diverge from what a unified Southwest should look like. The third institution is the judiciary, specifically the Court of Appeal and ultimately the Supreme Court. The 2023 election petition, which challenged Tinubu's victory on multiple grounds, was resolved in his favor, but the legal arguments made during that process remain embedded in public consciousness. Any future contestation of a 2027 result will draw on that existing jurisprudential record. The institutional memory of 2023 is not gone, it is dormant. Now, where does legitimate authority end and political overreach begin in this context? The Constitution is clear that the President has broad executive discretion in appointments, but established political convention in Nigeria, especially in the post-1999 democratic era, has created an expectation that geopolitical zones receive proportional representation in key federal ministries and agencies. That expectation is not law, but violating it has consequences that are entirely real. The deliberate ambiguity here is this: nobody can legally compel a president to balance appointment along regional lines, and that ambiguity benefits the presidency in the short term by insulating it from legal challenge, but it costs the presidency in political capital, and political capital is precisely what determines whether an incumbent survives a re-election campaign. Let me stop here and say something clearly. This is not about whether Yoruba people like or dislike Bola Tinubu personally. What we are analyzing is a structural political realignment, and those are far more durable and far more dangerous to an incumbent than personal feelings. Now, who gains from Yoruba dissatisfaction with Tinubu? The obvious answer is the opposition. The PDP and the Labour Party, particularly the Labour Party, given Peter Obi's demonstrated Southwest appeal in 2023, have every incentive to deepen this fracture. If they can consolidate the urban Yoruba vote that was always ambivalent about Tinubu, combined with their existing southeastern and minority belt support, the electoral arithmetic for 2027 begins to look different. But here is the less discussed gain. There are political actors within the APC itself who benefit from a weakened Tinubu. Internal APC dynamics ahead of 2027 will be shaped by who can credibly claim to be able to deliver the Southwest. Watch the governors. Watch which Southwest governors begin making independent political statements rather than simply echoing the presidency. That shift in tone, when it comes, will be the clearest institutional signal that the political ground is moving. Who loses? In the short term, the Southwest itself. A president who feels his base is abandoning him has less incentive to make concessions to that base. Political logic often drives incumbents towards consolidating new alliances rather than appeasing disillusioned old ones. If Tinubu pivots to the north, either through policy concessions, appointment patterns, or coalition building, as a hedge against Southwest attrition, the region could find itself with diminished federal leverage regardless of how the 2027 election resolves. What does 2027 actually look like from where Tinubu sits right now? That calculation is more complicated than his critics admit and more fragile than his supporters will tell you. We will map it out, but first, the national picture. Who is conspicuously silent? That is where you learn the most. Several prominent Yoruba political figures who were vocally supportive of Tinubu's candidacy in 2023 gone quiet. Not hostile, not supportive, quiet. In Nigerian politics, that specific silence has a name: strategic positioning. They are waiting to see whether the president course corrects before they decide which way to move. There is one name I have deliberately not mentioned yet, a political figure whose movement in the next 6 months will probably determine more about the Southwest's 2027 posture than anything else. I will tell you who that is and why before we close. What happens in the Southwest does not stay in the Southwest. That is the national stakes of this story. On the federal-state power balance, if a sitting president loses political credibility in his own region, the gravitational pull of executive authority weakens. State governors, even those from the same party, begin to act with greater autonomy. We are already seeing signs of this. Fiscal federalism debates, which had been relatively muted, are re-emerging. The conversation about state police, a constitutional amendment that requires broad geopolitical support, becomes harder to manage when the president cannot guarantee his own zone's legislative alignment. On the economy, the Southwest is home to Lagos, which contributes a disproportionate share of Nigeria's non-oil tax revenue and is the entry point for a significant portion of Nigeria's imports and exports. Political instability or governance ambiguity radiating from a fractured presidential coalition affects investor confidence, specifically in Lagos. Multinational firms and diaspora investors do not read press releases, they read political risk. And a president visibly at odds with his own base is a political risk flag. On security, political alienation historically creates space for non-state actors to present themselves as alternatives to failed government promises. The Southwest has its own security pressures, the farmer-herder conflict that has reached Ogun and Oyo, the persistent tension around Odua People's Congress activities, and the underlying agitation that found expression in the 2020 End SARS movement. A presidency that appears indifferent to Southwest concerns does not eliminate those pressures, it makes them harder to manage. For ordinary Nigerians, the majority of whom are nowhere near the centers of this political calculation, what matters is this: political fractures at the elite level translate to governance paralysis. When a president is managing coalition survival, the bandwidth for policy execution shrinks. The reforms that directly affect the lives of people living below the poverty line, fuel costs, food prices, exchange rate stability, school funding, require sustained political will. Coalition instability is the enemy of sustained political will. Consider this: the Naira lost approximately 70% of its value against the dollar in Tinubu's first year in office. That is not a political talking point, that is a documented economic fact. And in the Southwest, where the middle class has a higher proportion of dollar-denominated expenses, school fees, imported goods, foreign travel, that number is felt personally, not abstractly. Economics has a way of converting political disappointment into political action faster than anything else. Nigeria's domestic political turbulence has an international dimension that is easy to underestimate. Tinubu came into the presidency with an explicitly activist foreign policy posture, most visibly demonstrated in Nigeria's response to the Naija coup in 2023, where he pushed ECOWAS toward the possibility of military intervention before that position was ultimately walked back. That early assertiveness positioned him as a leader willing to project Nigerian weight on the continental stage. But assertive foreign policy requires political capital at home. A president fighting for domestic coalition survival is a president whose foreign policy bandwidth narrows. For the African Union and for Nigeria's bilateral partners, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and China, what matters is not whether Tinubu is popular with Yoruba voters. What matters is whether Nigeria is governable and whether its commitments are reliable. Political instability signals are read in Washington and London before they are resolved in Abuja. For Nigerians in the diaspora, in the UK, in the United States, in Canada, in South Africa, this story matters on two levels. First, the economic policies driving Southwest dissatisfaction are the same policies that affect remittance value, foreign investment decisions, and the cost of supporting family at home. Second, diaspora Nigerians are increasingly organized as a political constituency, not in the formal electoral sense, but in terms of narrative power, social media influence, and the ability to shape how Nigeria is perceived internationally. Their disillusionment is not inconsequential. This also connects to a broader global pattern, the challenge of sustaining democratic reform mandates in the face of economic hardship. From Zambia to Tunisia to Sri Lanka, we have seen electorates that supported reformist candidates turn sharply against them when economic pain arrived before economic recovery. Nigeria is not immune to that pattern, and 2027 will be in part a referendum on whether Nigerians believe the pain of 2023 and 2024 was a necessary investment in future stability or a failed experiment
with no visible return.
Now, before I give you my analytical conclusion, I want to make the strongest possible argument for the other side, because intellectual honesty requires that, and because the counter-argument here is not weak. The case for Tinubu is this. The reforms he implemented in 2023, fuel subsidy removal, foreign exchange unification, were painful precisely because they were necessary. Previous administrations avoided them because they were politically costly. A president willing to absorb short-term political pain for long-term structural improvement is by definition not acting in panic, he is governing. The Yoruba base's dissatisfaction on this reading is the reaction of a constituency that expected protection from the very economic medicine the country needed. And if the economy stabilizes and begins to recover through 2025 and 2026, the political narrative reverses entirely before the campaign window even opens. That is a serious argument. It deserves to be heard rather than dismissed. But here is where it breaks down. The strength of the economic reform argument depends entirely on the recovery timeline. If tangible improvement in household purchasing power does not materialize before mid-2026, the reform narrative transforms from a political asset into a political liability. The window is not unlimited. The most common misconception on social media is that this story is about ethnic loyalty, that Yoruba people are abandoning Tinubu because he has not done enough for Yoruba people specifically. That framing is both reductive and politically illiterate. What is actually happening is that Yoruba voters, like all Nigerian voters, evaluate incumbents primarily on economic conditions. The ethnic framing is a surface-level reading of what is fundamentally an economic dissatisfaction story. The nuance being lost in the noise is this. Tinubu's political survival does not depend on winning back every Yoruba voter who is currently disappointed. It depends on preventing the consolidation of that disappointment into a coherent electoral alternative. As long as the opposition remains fragmented and the Southwest has no single credible alternative champion, political dissatisfaction does not automatically convert into electoral defeat. So, what are the most likely moves from here? 3 scenarios, only one of them ends well for the presidency. The first scenario is course correction. The Tinubu administration makes visible, substantive concessions to Southwest concerns through appointments, through targeted economic relief in Lagos and Ogun, through a deliberate re-engagement with Yoruba civil society and political leadership. If this happens in the next 6 to 9 months, the current dissatisfaction remains manageable. Political bases have short memories when the incumbent delivers visible results. The second scenario is consolidation through distraction. The presidency pivots its political energy towards building new coalitions in the north and the southeast, calculating that a reduced but still sufficient southwest turnout combined with expanded support elsewhere produces a viable 2027 pathway. This is a higher-risk strategy because it requires the opposition to remain fragmented, a condition that is not guaranteed. The third scenario is escalation. The fracture deepens, Afenifere and other Yoruba political structures make formal declarations of opposition, and the Southwest becomes genuinely competitive in 2027. This scenario is currently the least probable, but it is no longer unthinkable. 3 months ago, it would not have appeared on this list at all. The specific signals to watch. Watch whether any prominent Southwest governor makes a public statement about 2027 that does not include an endorsement of the president. Watch the language coming out of Afenifere more carefully than the language coming out of Asorok. Watch whether Labour Party structures in Lagos begin receiving the kind of quiet funding and organizational attention that signals serious 2027 investment. The 12-month impact if the current trajectory holds Tinubu's administration moves into a more explicitly transactional phase, trading policy concessions for bloc loyalty rather than governing from a position of mandate confidence. This constrains reform ambition and extends economic instability. The 3-year impact. Nigeria arrives at the 2027 election with a genuinely competitive presidential race for the first time in the democratic era, one where the incumbent's home region is not his most reliable asset but his most contested battleground. I told you I would come back to the name I deliberately left out. Here it is, and it reframes the entire political calculation. The figure who will matter most to the 2027 Southwest story is not a president, a governor, or a party chairman. It is whoever emerges as the credible Yoruba voice of accountability, the person or institution that can hold the line between ethnic solidarity and democratic accountability without collapsing into either tribalism or irrelevance. That figure does not yet have a name, but when they appear, you will know them by the reaction they provoke from Asorok. Fear is the most reliable signal of political threat.
I asked you at the start of this video, if Tinubu cannot hold the Southwest, what is his path to 2027? Here is the honest answer. His path exists, but it is narrower than his 2023 campaign suggested, and it requires economic conditions to improve on a timeline that is not fully within his control. He does not need to win the Southwest unanimously. He needs to prevent the Southwest from becoming the story of his re-election campaign. That is a different and more achievable goal. But it is not a passive goal. It requires choices about appointments, about economic policy, about who he publicly listens to, which he has not made yet. Whether those choices get made and how quickly is the real political question heading into 2026. Now, I want to hear from you. Push back on this analysis. Tell me where you think I have the framing wrong. Tell me what I am missing about the Southwest political landscape. Tell me if you see a fourth scenario I have not considered. The quality of this channel depends on your thinking, not just mine. The thread I'm leaving unresolved deliberately. We have talked about what Yoruba voters want from a Yoruba president. We have not talked about what a post-Tinubu Yoruba political identity looks like, regardless of how 2027 resolves. That is the longer story, and it is the one we need to have. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.